the name of the panel, late afternoon panel, is driving the successful implementation of the fixed income tape. On that panel and through alphabetical orders, we'll have Julian Allen-Ellis from AFME, Liz Callaghan from ICMA, Liz Carter from Tradeweb, Vincent Dessard from EFAMA, Tim Kreutzmann from BVI, and Alex Wolcough from GreenBirch. So I'm trying to catch up the lost time on this one. So we're talking about driving the successful implementation of the tape, but are we going to implement something that we desire? And that's the first thing we'd like to check with you in that. We've prepared a small poll on the desirability of the fixed income consolidated tape to establish if that tape is really needed, what kind of products could be covered, and so on and so on. So you've got a few questions. The polling question, I do not know if you see that polling question, but please go to it. So the question is, it has been discussed that a phased approach to a fixed income CTP in Europe may be a more practical entry point. With this in mind, which data sets would you feel most useful for an initial phase? Bond post-trade data restricted to specific bond types, bond post-trade data, no phasing, all fixed income post-trade data, or the same as the above, plus pre-trade data, or no demand at all for the fixed income CT tape. From what I can see, it's fairly clear on the fact that most of the people, except 20%, so 4/5 of the people prefer post-trade data, and only 1/5 of the people would prefer pre-trade data to be included. And on that, it's all very balanced between the different composition of the console tape, with restricted to corporates and sovereigns, more or less equal with all bonds or all fixed income. Does anybody want to start the discussion about that? Alex, for instance.
Yeah, it's interesting. As far as the consolidated tape is concerned, I think the industry participants that we've been speaking to are in agreement that there is a group of bonds that they're particularly interested in on the corporate side, where they think that a tape in that space would add very strong value. So when we did a direct survey to the heads of trading at various different fixed income buy-side trading desks, particularly interested in investment grade and high yield bonds as well. As far as the derivatives and even the sovereign bonds, slightly less interested. It was interesting.
Thank you, Alex. Does anybody want to rebound on Alex's view on that? Does anybody have an opposing view? Julian, I know you may have shared some dissenting views at some point.
Philippe, I would never dissent, particularly not with a regulator, but I can always dissent with Alex. I'm more than happy to do that. Thanks very much, everybody, for having us on the panel. Yes, I think that survey showed a very accurate representation of the demand, for post-trade data. I think the users of that data should be the ones who we should ask about the scope and indeed about all the kind of technical elements of a proposed fixed income consolidated tape. To my mind, we think that the people who are going to make use of the tape, who are going to demand the tape and enjoy the benefits of the tape, are probably not going to be those most sophisticated traders. They'll be the kind of maybe retail, less sophisticated users, less frequent engagers with the market, who haven't already got, like many of AFME members will have already built, not exactly a consolidated tape, but at least a consolidated view of the market. They'll be taking their data directly from the venues, and they will have a demand for extremely low latency information. However, so what we shouldn't confuse is what the CTP is offering those less sophisticated, less frequent, possibly retail or less connected firms who haven't got their own architecture, with those who are going to benefit it. So I think when we're talking about what should the tape be, I think we should first say who's going to use it and what do they want, and then design that. So I will stop talking there.
Thank you, Julian. So basically what you're saying is we need to make a tape for those who can't afford the tape. Those who can already afford it got one. Liz, you wanted to comment on that?
I slightly agree with Julian, and I know often we've disagreed, and then there are times we do agree. I would say what a consolidated tape does is level the playing field. So you do have, right now there's an information asymmetry, if you want. So Julian's absolutely right. The big players can afford to spend all the money to aggregate the post-trade data that's out there and pay for aggregation tools to do that, and the smaller players can't. But you don't actually have to go down to the retail level to say that they are the ones that you should aim for. There are plenty of tier 2 firms, buy side and sell side, and even a fair amount of larger firms that absolutely want this. But the information asymmetry, that has to be addressed, and a consolidated tape is what can address it, and it will level the playing field, which is, as you know, a goal of MiFID 2.
Liz, you want to add something?
I thought it was a great poll to start the panel off. I think I agree with Julian. It's always so important on what the actual audience wants from the CTP and the consolidated tape. I was really encouraged that the feedback was, let's keep to something that's fairly simple to start with, so bonds and maybe even certain bond types. I think from my perspective, that's a sensible view. I think start simple, start relatively straightforward, get it working, low cost, time to market, and then look to evolve it. So I was quite comforted by that response, actually.
Thank you, Liz. Vincent, do you want to add something?
Yes, please. Maybe surprising to have a buy side to object to that, but from our members' perspective, they are more in favor of a global consolidated tape covering all type of instruments and not necessarily restricting them. So if it has to start with bonds, it would be not limited to bonds. And when I hear that the benefits would be for retail investors, I don't think our membership is made of retail investors, to say the least. And so I'm quite surprised to see the perception that it would be only for retail investors, much more from our perspective, also important for best execution, for instance.
Yeah, agreed.
The preparation or basically the price making of the data. So I would not agree with some of the comments made here.
Thank you, Vincent.
Can I just pop in and say one thing? Please. I think everyone would agree on, and was shown by your stats just now. Everyone thinks a pre-trade consolidated tape is absolutely unnecessary and not wanted by the industry. Keep it as it is with axes, etc., but no pre-trade consolidated tape. And I think everyone would nod in agreement with that.
Even the regulators.
Great, we like that.
Tim, do you want to add your voice to that concert of people saying we only want to have a post-trade and no pre-trade?
Yeah, sure. So from our member side, it's when we ask about the CTP, the consolidated tape in general, we actually got the responses that from all options, the post-trade fixed income tape would be the most desirable. So we are not so much keen of the equity side actually, but it's the fixed income and the post-trade. Knowing that it's still some questions to be answered, or how it will actually work, how it's going to be paid. But even our not so small members like the idea of the post-trade fixed income tape.
Okay. Just a quick question. Do you think the fixed income tape has to be somehow linked to the equities console tape, or must it lead, or could it live an independent life?
Independent.
Yeah.
Very quick answer for you. I think they need to run at their own speed. They need to be focused for the audience that they're targeted for. There may be some benefits of some overlaps as far as technology, but let's see if that happens as the implementation works. But they should be their own business streams and run and target the industries that they're servicing.
If I may say, my kids wanted to be independent, but it was not up to the point of being financially independent. So how does it work financially then? Can the Consolidated be financially independent when we discussed previously that those who want to have the CTP cannot afford it, or those who are already can afford it already have one?
Well, they've already got buy-side firms who focus purely on equity, and then there are some buy-side firms that have equity and fixed income. So in some respects, would you force an equity firm to buy fixed income even if they weren't interested in it? That's my throwback to you, Philippe. On the other hand, the scale and the distribution, infrastructure, I think there's been enough technology advances that this could be done independently, so that the cost base, you could get efficiencies because the cost base is spread across equities and fixed income. But actually the entry point for technology is quite low if people want to use modern technologies.
I think that's some interesting thoughts there, and I think certainly the tape, and I will correct the impression if I gave the wrong one that I suggested the tape was only for retail. It should be aimed at democratizing information across all users, but not those kind of larger firms who are already directly connected through low latency connections to. So the less sophisticated, the ones who it isn't that trading isn't their primary business. So it would include investment managers and smaller brokers. So just to make that point clear for the record. But I think the tape needs to be simple. It needs to, as Alex said, it needs to be run on proven technology. It needs to be, the operator of such a consolidated tape needs to be very familiar, very comfortable, and have a long track record of dealing with it with an enormous amount of data seamlessly. So I think we should have those considerations at mind. But yes, something simple. What the industry does not want would be a all singing, all dancing, lightning fast a sort of white elephant that is over-engineered for the purposes.
Just to add there, we had, as you know, ECMA had a CT task force, and we asked our CT task force very detailed, how should we fund this? Because we know that's an obstacle right now to why a consolidated tape has not emerged. And it was interesting. We asked two questions. We said, if you had anything, what would it be? And the view was actually ESMA owning it, and so ESMA governing the CTP. But then when we asked, what do you think would most likely emerge? And that was a public-private partnership with cost recovery through end-user fees. And that's pretty much kind of the way things are going. But it doesn't mean you can't have, Philippe, to your earlier question, linking equities to fixed income. The key, we've already seen this with, and not to bring MiFID up again, but we've already seen the problems of the equitization of the bond market and thinking that the bond market works like equities. It doesn't. And so what we don't want is a CTP where assumptions are made based on equities. So people handling, the data engineers are actually equity data engineers and don't understand bonds or the life cycle of bonds, the events, etc. So, but the governance and funding could be the same. So there's no reason why you can't have the same framework for governance and funding. It's when you get to the next level and the technology and particularly the industry expertise needed to run a CTP, that needs to have, that's where it splits. And there's sort of, there's the equity, there are the equity experts and then the fixed income experts, or bond, I should say, experts. Your
question regarding funding will bring us to the second polling question, because at some point, if you want funding, you need to have people pay for something they're going to use. And the second polling question is, what is the main use case your firm would have for a fixed income CTP? Market overview, price discovery, best execution, to satisfy regulatory requirements. Oh, I like this one. To create value-added service products for clients, multiple use cases listed above. I'd be very disappointed, I cannot vote, if we do not have a majority for our multiple use cases listed above. Agreed. Not trying to influence you.
Philip, you're definitely leading the witness there. Objection.
Maybe while the poll's going on, I was just going to add just a very, I think, simplistic point to the question you had, Philippe, about does the bond CTPs or consolidated tape have to emerge at the same time as the equity, and should it be the one provider, etc. And I just feel that the fact that we have the absence of a CTP today and no one stepped forward to kind of wear that badge, I think we should just not be too prescriptive in how this evolves. I think let the industry and the service providers who may wish to do this to come up with their own sort of suggestions on how best to operate it. I tend to get a little bit concerned that if we overprescribe how it should be done, and on what basis that this just then makes it so much a tougher challenge for some people.
All is in the over-prescribing, because at some point, without prescriptions, no one made the console tape beforehand. So at some point, there'll be some form of prescription. I've just have the results of the poll. So as expected, thank you very much, multiple use cases listed above. And nobody actually wants to use it for single-use best execution, which is also quite reassuring into that, because from what I understand, there are still lots of quality issues at the moment with the bond console tape, and somebody using bond console tape for best execution would have, I would say, creative results to my understanding. Just a quick question. So we want to do it, we've got to use, we've got usage of that, but in terms of technicality, are we ready? Alex, you said everything has changed and now we are ready, it can be done easily, swiftly, not too complicated. Is it still your opinion? And is it shared by everybody?
I think there's some evolution in technology at the moment, which does make it easier to aggregate, process and retransmit data, which is what an aggregator is doing, a consolidated tape provider. I think there are still some open challenges at the technical level, which is agreeing a common data standard to use. We've got some of the really good building blocks, and I'm going to go and blow fixed trading community's trumpet here and say, with some small changes to the way that we design the message, we could actually get to a very useful consolidated tape from an information perspective. But if you look at the cost to go and aggregate from the traditional market data vendors, it used to be very expensive. I mean, I used to work at Reuters and putting together a consolidated European view and equities was in the millions. But now this is significantly cheaper. So actually, it would be interesting to go and see some of the old hands as far as experience that Julian was talking about and Liz was talking about, getting the right people, but behind new technology. It wouldn't be that difficult or that expensive to actually put a new infrastructure in place that actually build something which was fit for purpose.
Well, it would also, with this new CTP provider, be prepared to be governed by ESMA by, I think it's March 2022, because they will be governed by ESMA by 2022.
I don't think it actually necessarily exists as an entity today, Liz. But I do think that if the banks were and the buy side were offered the opportunity to work together with the regulator, that a utility could actually be set up with ESMA to do that relatively quickly.
Just a quick question regarding ESMA. You said about, you talked about the European Consolidated Tape. For me, I understand the European Consolidated Tape would encompass, for instance, Swiss or UK data. Do you think in a reasonable future, UK industry abiding by ESMA rules?
In transparency, yes. I think they'd be willing to do that. I don't know if anyone else disagrees.
Well, I think it's post-trade data. It is after the deferral. So however the deferrals are set, the FCA could have a divergent approach, after Brexit. So they may even come up with a different liquidity assessment methodology. However, once, this is all after that, after it's applied. So the APAs are actually applying and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, the APAs are doing all the deferral application, everything else. Once this gets into the consolidated tape, all of that transparency bit has been done. So whether the FCA has a different liquidity assessment or the Swiss do or whatever, it still can get in there. There will have to be some normalizing of the data. So this is where people, you can say that you can get the kit off the shelf and it's cheap. My element is, or my important bit to bring up is database engineers who know what they're doing, data scientists, whatever you want to call them, and also bond experts. So if you have cheaper kit, that's fine, great, bring it on. But you cannot go cheap with the industry knowledge or the understanding how to tweak the data to normalize it so that everyone is looking at the same thing. Because what the market wants is a pan-European view of the market. And to Vincent's point, eventually a global view. How cool would it be to then put trace onto this and look at a global, okay, it's not purely global, but still, a US and European view of the market.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I think we know that the CT, the consolidated tape, whether it's bonds, whether it's broader than bonds, I think has to be a European. It has to include the UK markets. I think that's absolutely fact, and I think everyone's nodding, which is good. That's certainly my understanding. I think the APAs, just coming back to the technical kind of side of things and how to keep the costs low, because at the end of the day, this is what we want. We want a low cost operation, an efficient operation, so that the consumers of the data do not have unrealistic and high prices to pay for the data. So I think what's key in my mind is we leverage the existing infrastructure. We've been with MiFID, MiFID 2, MiFIR now 2.5 years. The APAs, the venues, they have these processes. As Liz said, deferrals are applied. Let's leverage the infrastructure we have today. And really, I think Alex said it as well, the CTP should slot on the end of that. They should be the aggregator. Their primary role should be aggregating the data and making that data easily accessible for everyone. And that should be the focus. And I think it's really important from a technical and an operational perspective that we keep that and we keep it simple and we leverage the expertise and, the energy and the effort that have gone into what we've got so far. It might not be perfect, but what my biggest concern is throwing it out and starting with new things or trying to get, as Julian said, too ambitious will just mean that we will never get a consolidated tape that's of any use to anyone. Yeah. And that's my opinion.
I agree.
I was just saying, well said, Liz. She summed it up perfectly as the poster person for this project. Yeah, set yourself up to fail by creating a white elephant. Not a good plan. That's too expensive and force people to consume it. No. As a being of a neoliberal economical bent, as I think we all are on this panel, we should be looking to the market to set the pricing level appropriately. That is a great feedback loop for if you've developed something that is wanted by people, then people will pay for it. The idea of mandatory consumption just gives up on creating something good. It just says, we'll create something, have no feedback loop to test its benefits. And so we'd be very much against the mandatory consumption of it. We'd support mandatory contribution from our members, systematic internalizers, and also the venues and APAs. And yes, something that is achievable, simple, efficient, and fit for those people who put their hands up and say, I want it, and here's how much I'm going to pay for the package.
Yeah. And would you agree on compensation to the contributors based on the overall quality of the information contributed?
I certainly do. I think that the contribution back to the data providers should be based on quantity. So in other words, kind of like your market share, and also your quality. And Liz knows that in the ICMA CGP group, we did look at, and discussed with Tillman the benefit of kind of having a scorecard. And I think that's really important because it achieves kind of the fairness of the compensation back to the contributors based on the volume, but it also encourages that high benchmark for the quality of the data, and that there can be penalties if the data isn't usable and doesn't add value, because who's going to want to buy data, as we all know, that isn't valuable?
But the key on this one also is the data quality scorecard score is based on aggregated data. So this isn't Joe Schmo sending his data in. This is the APAs and the quality of the data that they are aggregating. And also on this, in the Consolidated Tape Task Force, we also mentioned that in order to have a reasonable fee for the market participants, you absolutely could not have data. Let's say absolutely, we had to have our language in the report correct. But basically, data ownership had, or should be, not be with APAs or trading venues, because otherwise the view was that the end user would pay too much. So data ownership should be factored in when coming up with a solution. And that was a view of many, but not all, because we had a mixed Consolidated Tape Task Force.
Just maybe one point to add, if it's to have some return to data providers or whoever you name them now, this would be only at a second stage. Why? Because first, the financing of the consolidated tape must be the first level of the channeling of the development. If it's working well, then why not? But it should not come first with recouping any cost from the data providers, whatever you name them, once again, but first addressing and channeling the financing towards the consolidated tape. If it works well, if there is any profit, why not? But first have the consolidated tape working. Otherwise, it will never work.
I think that's right. I think you have to take the operating cost away first, and then if you have a revenue pool left, which hopefully, if this data is valuable, people want to buy it, and it's easily accessible, then you should have that additional revenue pool. But I do think it's important, in a practical sense, for the CTP to work. If, as maybe we're led to believe, and what might happen, and Philippe, you might want to comment on this, if consumers are mandated to provide their data to the consolidated tape, then, it does need to follow through that there should be an incentive that accompanies that as well. So I hear you, and I think operating cost comes first. But then I think it is something that probably needs to happen. Because largely it's because these service providers, they were required, like for us, we were required to be an APA. That was something that was necessary under MiFID 2, and we've put a lot of time, energy, and cost into running an APA, and to sort of have that turned around, that's something that needs to be thought through.
That's one of the reason why we believe that it should be covering all type of in asset, because it's also fixing the cost by including equities. If the exchanges are mandated, they have charges, they have revenues, and they have the data. If we have only fixed income, the cost will be only on one set of assets to pay for the data, whereas some others are already having the data, having them mandatorily stored. So that's why we believe that it should be a joint effort, equities and non-equities. So going back to the cost and the sharing of the cost and the step approach would be
That's interesting. I would probably say that we have to agree to disagree there. That's all, because from an operator, I kind of see that, you know, costs can quickly spiral from offering one asset class to multiple asset classes. You know, you need the expertise, you need, you know, a lot more other stuff. It doesn't always just simply come together and save money. So I think very pleased to listen to your opinion. I think from an operator, service provider, I don't think it always is that closely aligned. I don't know if other people have views. Happy to hear.
Only to agree, actually. Having been in a service provider as well myself, and actually seeing that the infrastructure used for bringing in equity and processing equity data and then non-equity data, there are efficiencies around comms lines into businesses and efficiencies about collecting data, but actually there's a good network of providers where there can be a consortium that can work together to deliver the overall proposition. But I, as I say, the core processing hub, the very sort of like the core processing, the knowledge, the expertise, and the technology may actually end up being two separate systems altogether, and very likely to be.
Yeah, and I think that's where everyone is kind of, not everyone, but I'm sorry, Vincent, where a lot of us are coming from. We don't have any problem in sharing the synergies, the technical synergies. Completely makes sense. You know, if the pipes can handle both asset classes, bonds and equities, I'm a little nervous saying non-equities because that can also bring in derivatives to this. And so I think for this conversation, I believe it's bond and equities. I absolutely believe they should be worked on at the same time. So in other words, the starting gun for both asset classes should be the same time. Understanding bonds has to get over the hurdles of data quality. So it'll probably take longer to actually, you know, get over the finishing line than equities, but they should be started at the same time. And there shouldn't be this, oh, we'll wait and, you know, see, let's watch equities, and a couple of years later, we'll think about doing bonds. That definitely shouldn't be the case. But I don't see any reason why you can't share technology. Just make sure you've got the industry expertise and data expertise linked to the industry expertise working on bonds. If you've got synergies, by all means, go for it.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm going to use that finishing line to say that we're moving perilously closer to the finishing line of that panel. And we still have one polling question that I would like to fire immediately because we have less than 5 minutes left. What do you believe are the 3 key success factors of delivering a successful fixed income console tape? You've got 3 choices and only 3 choices. Thank you very much. Before having the answers, we haven't touched about governance. So we've talked about technicality. We haven't talked about governance. So I very thoroughly expect that governance will top up the poll on the 3rd question. I'm not sure about it, but I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. Don't want to have an influence on you guys, but if you still have one missing answer, please press on A. Yeah! Finishing second, which is in the top 3. And I totally agree on data quality standards because everybody knows rubbish in, rubbish out. So definitely, if you want a successful product, you need quality product. And after that, you've got governance. And the 3rd one is the funding model. I totally agree on this one as well, because you cannot have a proper governance without a funding model. All those two are working together. Anybody wants to comment on this one?
I was a little surprised on market share that was quite low, because I kind of thought that would be a little bit higher myself. But that was interesting. That was my comment.
And I think it was quite interesting that cost of market data was quite low as well. And my read of that is that we have a very intelligent and well-informed bunch of attendees voting, because they've noted the fact that the consolidated tape is not going to solve for high data prices. So we need to make sure that we remove that as a kind of a driver. You know, and sort of linked to governance, you know, the solution to the problem of a consolidated tape not emerging or perhaps not being fit for purpose is not to impose a mandatory consumption of the consolidated tape, as in many cases that would mean it would be really unfair for investment firms that they'd be forced to pay effectively twice, both for their existing direct data feeds, which they would continue to need for low latency purposes, and their consolidated tape data, essentially paying twice. So that feels really unfair. Instead, we should really focus on reducing the cost of market data that is provided by incumbent exchanges. You know, that they currently hold a position of significant market power from a pricing perspective. And it's important to be mindful of the potential consolidated tape models, which would be really unhelpful, in which exchanges would then be paid twice for the same data. And policymakers, you know, we really think that should consider very carefully the provision of data to the consolidated tape to be free of charge.
Just to comment on Julian's point, he's absolutely right about cost of data. But that is very much a perceived equity problem, because it's an exchange issue, and there have been many, many discussions on that, and that definitely needs to be sorted in the equity discussions. The cost of data as far as bonds go, that gets solved with data ownership and governance. And then the cost to the end user is minimal with, as Alex says, with the technology that's out there today. So I really, really am impressed with the audience here, because they were able to differentiate between equities and fixed income, which is why cost of data is not way up there, because cost of data in equities would be off the scale on this question.
I've got a question from the audience, and the question is, who's going to own the data eventually? Do you consider it could be a public good that would be an open access?
There isn't data ownership. That was probably one of the most major discussions that we had. And again, we did have differing views, because there is a lot of money to be made, quite frankly, from data ownership. This is why it's such a big discussion in the equity markets. But data ownership cannot be with, I mean, right now, the buy side could easily say, hey, it's our data, we own it. They could say that, but they're not. So at the end of the day, no one owns the data. It is a public good. And that's how you, the end users will be able to afford this consolidated tape.
So on that consolidated tape, all historical data would be an open access for everybody.
Yes, please. I'd be an advocate of that as well.
Hang on. There are, you know, we have the raw data. So what we didn't get into was what actually goes into the tape. So you have, to Julian's point, it's simple raw data that goes into the tape. But if that data is somehow improved, enriched, that is then charged. And whoever does that, whether it's consolidated tape provider or even APAs or Reuters or whomever, you know, they charge for that. And anyone who wants to buy historical data and use all sorts of analytical tools to do TCA and this sort of thing, they will have to pay for it. But that is, at that point, enriched data. It's not plain old raw data, which should be the cheap bit that we're talking about here.
And at the bare
I think the point is it's data transformation. It's, you know, yes, the data is the counterparty's data, but it depends how that data is transformed, and if that data is transformed significantly, then that isn't really the same data. That's a different data set. And I think that's where the data ownership bit gets a little bit tricky and needs to be well thought out.
Yeah.
Vincent, you wanted to say something, and after that, that will be Alex.
Basically, at least we should have access to the raw data of each firm's trading, transformed or not. It's a totally different debate, but the raw data of the trade should be placed in one place where we have access to our data, also to ensure that we have our reporting and regulatory reporting in one place. For us, it's a way to save and make some savings from the data costs.
Alex?
Yeah, so my view is that you pay for the quality of service. You pay more for something which is real time. You have a delayed feed which is for free, and historical access, well, you pay for the storage costs. But limiting the use of that data by slapping a license on top of it, I think would be unfair. And I think people should be able to build on top of that data and build the value on top of that data.
Team, any views regarding that topic?
Yeah, maybe I'm drawing the line back to the first poll questions when we hear there's no intention on value-added services to be used from the CT data. So I would assume that we're pretty much on the consumption side, not on the gold plating of the data.
Thank you very much. We are nearly reaching the end of the panel. There's a last opportunity for somebody to mention a point that has been forgotten. Anyone has a topic that might have been forgotten? I think we've nearly covered all we wanted to cover. So the fixed income console tape is desirable, is feasible, as long as you've got a proper governance and the proper data quality, if I may summarize that. And Julian, was that your voice I heard?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Philippe. There's a lag on the line. We've managed to get through the whole session without talking, mentioning the T word, mentioning trace. And I think we've moved on from trying to think that what we need to do in Europe is import traces scope. And I just wanted to maybe head off that discussion and point out how limited the amount of corporate bonds are on trace. The fact that US Treasury bonds reported on a trade-by-trade basis are published in aggregate to help market participants understand about the volume and liquidity of the bonds. There is a 15-minute delay, but most of the trades are reported after 3 p.m. anyway for market structure reasons when they're spotted. And there was, there's six months of volume masking. So it's a very, very different environment here where MiFID requires buy side and sell side to report variously. Therefore, the quality of the data has been under pressure from that requirement. And also US broker dealers, members of FINRA, have an easier job reporting a fairly small scope of corporate bonds and treasury bonds with delays to trace. So I just wanted to head off that. Let's have a trace type product over here.
Thank you very much. Just as a regulator, I just also want to point out that regulators are still working on liquidity deferrals and so on bonds, and that the landscape also might evolve in the coming months. So this is all it for that panel. I would like to thank you very much for your contribution, and I've been required beforehand to hand the floor to Deb, who has some important messages to pass. Deb, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the panel. Thanks for everybody for joining this session. Just a reminder, a recording of the session will be available from next Thursday on the platform for 30 days after the event. And join the next session, please, which is the event wrap-up, the U.S. Perspective on Europe. And if you get a moment, go take a look at our sponsors booth in the virtual exhibit hall and network with other attendees in the networking lounge. Don't forget to join the live demos, and you can find an agenda in the information desk. We have a competition running, just as a reminder for those who visit all of the sponsor booths in the exhibit hall, and they'll go into a draw to win a prize. So thank you very much for joining this session, and enjoy the rest of the day.